Good morning, children. Welcome to English Literature class. Today, the topic of our discussion is Hearts and Hands. By the end of this video, you will be able to understand the theme, setting, and summary of the story. Also, you will be able to express the story in your own words. Let's begin the class, children. First of all, let's read about the author. O. Henry was born on September 11, 1862 in Greensboro, North Carolina, to Dr. Algernon Sidney Potter and Mary Jane Virginia Swaim Potter. He was an avid reader since his childhood and enjoyed reading Anatomy of Melancholy and the 1001 Nights. The meaning of avid is enthusiastic. He became a prolific writer, penning around 381 short stories. For over a year, he submitted one story every week to the New York World Sunday magazine. His most famous short stories are The Gift of the Magi, The Ransom of Red Chief, etc. Now, children, before we read about the story, I'll give you a brief introduction to the story. The story Hearts and Hands describes the chance encounter between Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton. They meet in a train compartment. They are acquainted with each other. When Miss Fairchild observes that Mr. Easton is handcuffed to another man, she is bewildered and horrified. The other man tells Miss Fairchild that Mr. Easton is a marshal who is taking him to prison. However, in the end, it turns out that Mr. Easton is the prisoner and the other man is a marshal who is taking him to prison. Let's read about the story. Hearts and Hands revolves around three main characters and two minor characters who reveal irony at the end of the story. A surprise ending makes the story interesting. The story is set in a train to Denver. An elegantly dressed woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. The meaning of irony: a situation in which something which was intended to have a particular result has the opposite or a very different result. Elegantly dressed means gracefully attired. Hearts and Hands revolves around three main characters: Miss Fairchild, Mr. Easton, and Marshall. Two characters. There are two passengers who at the end of the story reveal the irony. The story Hearts and Hands is set in a train to Denver where a gracefully attired woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and sit on the seat opposite to her. It quickly becomes apparent that the woman knows one of them. She speaks to the man, Mr. Easton, and then she is surprised to discover that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. As Easton greets the young woman, he raises his right hand, bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet, to the left one of his companion. The meaning of apparent: clear, handcuffed, bound with handcuffs, bracelet, handcuffs. When two men enter the train, it quickly becomes clear that Miss Fairchild knows one of the men, that is Mr. Easton. She speaks to him and is rather surprised to discover that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. As Easton greets the young woman, he raises his right hand. Miss Fairchild observes that his right hand is handcuffed to the left hand of his companion. The man with Easton senses Easton's embarrassment and gives the explanations. He says that Easton is the marshal and the two are headed for Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting. He adds, the meaning of embarrassment is awkward feelings. Meaning of marshal, an officer having charge of prisoners. Are headed for, are going towards. Counterfeiting, making an exact copy of something to deceive someone. Here, when Miss Fairchild sees Mr. Easton handcuffs, he feels embarrassed. The other man understands Mr. Easton's situation and says to Miss Fairchild that Mr. Easton is the marshal and he himself is a prisoner. Mr. Easton is taking him to Leavenworth prison, where he will be imprisoned for 7 years for the crime of counterfeiting. The young woman continues to chat with her acquaintance, but she continues to stare at the handcuffs. "Don't you worry about them, miss," said the other man. "All the marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them from getting away. Mr. Easton knows his business." As the two men stand to go to the smoker car, the young woman bids Mr. Easton goodbye. Meaning of acquaintance, the person with whom one is familiar. Stare, to look continuously. The young woman keeps on talking to her acquaintance, Mr. Easton, but continuously stares at the handcuffs. To ease her concern, the other man satisfies her about the handcuffs by saying that all marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoner so that they do not run away. Finally, the two men get up to go to the smoker car and Miss Fairchild says goodbye to Mr. Easton. All the while, two passengers seated nearby have listened to the conversation. One says that he seems to be too young to be a marshal. The other says, "Mr. Easton is not a marshal. He is the counterfeiter. Did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand?" This ending surprises the readers and makes the story interesting. Counterfeiter, a person who makes a copy that looks like the original of something. When Miss Fairchild was talking to the two men, two other passengers seated nearby were listening to their conversation. One of them remarked that from his appearance, Mr. Easton appeared to be so young that he cannot be a marshal. The other passenger tells him that Mr. Easton is not the marshal, he is a criminal, because no marshal would handcuff his prisoners to his own right hand. Now, children, let's go through the summary in detail. On a train to Denver, the story Hearts and Hands is set in a train to Denver. An elegantly attired woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. One is of handsome presence with a bold, frank countenance, manner, and the other is a ruffled, glum-faced person, heavily built and roughly dressed. Attired means dressed. Countenance, facial expression. Ruffled, untidy. Glum-faced, having gloomy appearance. Children, as I have already told you that the story is set in a train to Denver, where a gracefully dressed woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and sit on the seat opposite to her. One looks confident, honest, and handsome, whereas the other is heavily built and looks sad. Both these contrasting looking men are handcuffed to each other. It quickly becomes apparent that the woman knows one of them. She speaks to this man whose name is Mr. Easton. She says, "Well, Mr. Easton, if you make me speak first, I suppose I must. Don't you ever recognize old friends when you meet them in the West?" The man rouses himself sharply at the sound of her voice. He overcomes his embarrassment and then clasps her finger with his left hand. Apparent, clear. Overcomes, succeeds in dealing with a problem. Embarrassment, feeling of shame. Clasps, grabs tightly with hand. Miss Fairchild begins the conversation with Easton. She asks him if he has not recognized her. Then she sarcastically remarks if it is a practice in the western part of America to not recognize old friends. Children, through these words, it is clear that they know each other. On hearing Miss Fairchild's voice, Mr. Easton feels a little embarrassed because he was handcuffed. Then he gets up quickly and holds her fingers with his left hand to greet her. A surprise for Miss Fairchild. Miss Fairchild is rather surprised to discover that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. As Easton greets the young woman, he slightly raises his right hand, bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet, to the left one of his companion. The glad look in girl's eyes slowly changes to bewildered horror. Miss Bracelet handcuffs. Bewildered, confused. Miss Fairchild observes that Mr. Easton's right hand is tied to the left hand of the other man, who is sitting near him. In other words, she is not able to understand why Mr. Easton is handcuffed, so she is confused. She is glad to meet Mr. Easton, but now this glad look in her eyes changes into bewildered horror. The glow fades from her cheeks. Easton, with a little laugh, as if amused, is about to speak again when the other man forestalls him. The glum-faced man has been watching the girl's countenance with his shrewd eyes. He senses Easton's embarrassment and volunteers an explanation that Easton is the marshal and the two are headed for Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting, he tells her. Glow, a redness of the cheeks, fades, loses color. Amused, finding something funny, forestalls, prevents, countenance, facial expression, shrewd, cunning, embarrassment, feeling of shame, counterfeiting, to make an exact copy of something to deceive someone. Now, children, on seeing Mr. Easton's hand bound with handcuff, Miss Fairchild is bewildered and struck with horror. So the rosy color of her cheeks begins to faint. Easton is about to speak when the other man stops him in between. The man senses Easton's embarrassment and volunteers to clear the doubts in Miss Fairchild's mind about the handcuff, that Mr. Easton is the marshal and he himself is a prisoner, and they are going towards Leavenworth prison. He is going to be imprisoned for 7 years for committing the crime of counterfeiting. Children, here we are told that the other man has been given a punishment of 7 years because he has committed the crime of making an exact copy of something valuable with the intention to cheat. Conversation with Easton. As the conversation continues, the woman is surprised to learn that Easton has discarded his life in Washington to become a marshal in the West. But she finds the West agreeable as well. The young woman continues to chat with her acquaintance, but she continues to stare at the handcuffs. Now, during the conversation, Miss Fairchild comes to know that Mr. Easton has given up his carefree life in Washington to become a marshal in the western part of America. But she thinks that the life in the West is also quite enjoyable. Though Miss Fairchild is relieved to know that Mr. Easton is a marshal, she is still worried about the handcuffs. To ease her concern, the rough-looking older man tells her, "Don't you worry about them, miss. All marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoner to keep them from getting away. Mr. Easton knows his business." "Will we see you again soon in Washington?" asked the girl. "Not soon, I think," said Easton. "My butterfly days are over, I fear." As the two men stand to go to the smoker car, the young woman bids Mr. Easton goodbye. To ease her concern, the state of being very comfortable. When the other man observes that Miss Fairchild is continuously staring at the handcuffs, in order to make her feel comfortable, the other man tells her that all marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners so that they do not run away. He also tells her that Mr. Easton is a responsible person who performs his duty well. The woman takes a sigh of relief and asks him whether they can meet again. But Mr. Easton says that his carefree days of roaming are over, and now it is the time to go to duty. Finally, the two men get up to go to the smoker car, and Miss Fairchild says goodbye to Mr. Easton. A shocking revelation. All the while, two passengers seated nearby have listened to their conversation. One remarks that Mr. Easton seems too young to be a marshal. The other eavesdropping passenger corrects the mistake, one that the young women and readers have likely made as well, saying that Mr. Easton is not the marshal, he is the counterfeiter. "Oh, didn't you catch on?" the passenger says. "Say, did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand?" Eavesdropping means secretly listen to a conversation. When Miss Fairchild was talking to the two men, the two other passengers seated nearby were listening to their conversation. One of them remarked that from his appearance, Mr. Easton appears to be so young that he cannot be a marshal. The other passenger tells him that Mr. Easton is not the marshal, he is criminal, because no marshal would handcuff his prisoners to his own right hand. So, here we have a surprise ending through the remark of the passengers. We come to know that Mr. Easton is a criminal and the glum-faced man is the marshal. He tells a lie to Miss Fairchild in order to save him from an unpleasant and uncomfortable situation. Theme. A theme is a central topic, subject or message on a story. Hearts and Hands presents an ironical situation with a surprise ending. The irony at the end of the story makes the story interesting. The unexpected revelation about the real situation in which Mr. Easton was placed surprises the readers. Children, the story Hearts and Hands has a surprise ending. As I have already told you that Mr. Easton, who was thought to be a marshal, was actually the criminal and the glum-faced man was the real marshal. This is the irony which is revealed at the end of the story, and it surprises the readers and makes the story interesting. Now let's read the ironical situation and the surprise ending. The story is set in a train to Denver. An elegantly dressed woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. It quickly becomes apparent that the woman knows one of them. She speaks to this man, Mr. Easton, and then she is rather surprised to discover that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. As Easton greets the young woman, he slightly raises his right hand, bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet to the left one of his companion. The man with Easton senses the lady's embarrassment and gives an explanation. He says that Easton is the marshal and the two are headed for the Leavenworth prison. Apparent, clear. Handcuffed, tied. Embarrassment, feeling of shame. It's 7 years for counterfeiting, he says. The young woman continues to stare at the handcuffs. To ease her concern, the other man tells her that all marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them from getting away. Two passengers seated nearby have listened to the conversation. One remarks that Easton seems to be too young to be a marshal. The other remarks that he is not the marshal but is the counterfeiter. He says, "Did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand?" This unexpected remark deepens the mystery and surprises the readers. So, the story gives us the message that appearances are often deceptive. What we say may not be true, just like Mr. Easton, who was said to be the marshal, was the real criminal, and the glum-faced man who admitted that he was criminal was the real marshal. Now, children, let's have a look on setting of the story now. Children, whenever we are discussing the setting of the story, we mention time and place and where the action of the story takes place. So the action of the story Hearts and Hands takes place in a train which is going to the east. And there are three main characters: Miss Fairchild, Mr. Easton, Marshall. There is no reference to time in the story. So in the story, they are involved in the conversation, and through their conversation, we come to know that Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton know each other. All the actions take place in the train itself. So that's all for today's work, children. I hope you have understood story, theme and setting of the story well. And your homework is to revise theme and summary of the story by heart. Thank you.